Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me today for this webinar. Boy, are we in tough and weird times. And my goal for our time today is really just to change the narrative of what we're facing from one of fear and uncertainty to helping you find resilience in your financial futures. A couple of housekeeping notes before we jump in. The seminar is going to be recorded, and access to the recording will be made available afterwards. And please, by all means, share it if you'd like. And I will be inviting you to the seminar for next month as well. Again, at the end of this seminar, you'll have all the information you need with regards to both how to ask me questions, which we won't be able to address today, unfortunately, but you will have access to me by a number of different means, and I'll show you that later. And furthermore, again, with respect to how to see next month's seminar as well. And away we go. So by way of introduction, my name is Monique Madan, and I'm a certified financial planning professional, a financial management advisor, and a chartered financial divorce specialist. Now, I happen to have come to financial planning in a bit of an oblique way. My undergraduate studies are actually in neuropsychopharmacology, and I only turned to personal finance a little bit later in my career. Now, that being said, I have been a certified financial planning professional for nearly 20 years, gulp. And in that time, I've worked with people really spanning the gamut of different circumstances, from high net worth clients to those who are very, very vulnerable, and virtually every conceivable situation in between. Now, if you were to ask me who might benefit most from our work together, I'd have to say the greatest benefit I can provide are to people who are facing some sort of a difficult decision. Now, that decision may have to do with optimizing their financial situation, or it may have to do with balancing the here and now and the future. And certainly the current state of our economy, and in fact the world, certainly means that more Canadians than ever before are finding themselves having to make those very tough decisions. UPotential is a fee-for-service financial planning firm, and it offers unbiased advice to Canadians who are looking for advice specifically with respect to strategy. The name UPotential was born from the way in which our clients feel inspired to make the most of their financial situations and plan for a bright and stable future. In partnership with Larry Berman, I'm very proud to offer my services to the clients of ETF Capital Management as well, and it happens to be as part of their suite of client services. In this way, ETF Capital Management clients can get both unbiased strategy with me and alongside the best-in-class investment advisory services that they receive from Larry. This particular seminar was inspired by a research study released by FP Canada. FP Canada is my professional college, and periodically they poll Canadians about financial well-being. The survey sampled Canadians in virtually every walk of life and from every region of the country. These surveys then, which are conducted, as I said, periodically, provide insight into whether changes in public education or government services or fiscal policies, amongst other factors, are really having any impact whatsoever on the financial well-being of the Canadian public. Now, when we talk about financial well-being, financial planners in particular are referring to the kind of confidence that Canadians exude with regards to their financial futures. So, for example, financial well-being could involve helping clients to contextualize day-to-day stressors. In other words, helping clients appreciate whether it's a market change or other crisis is permanent or temporary, and how that might affect their long-term financial stability. It could also involve helping clients identify the strengths and weaknesses of his or her own financial situations as it might relate to perhaps job security or the risk of future interest rate increases. So really contextualizing outside factors to each and every person's idiosyncratic situation. One of the topics we're going to be focusing on later in this presentation is building financial resilience, which goes well beyond emergency funding and manageable debt levels, and well beyond, typical diversification of an investment portfolio. These bedrock considerations that we're going to be talking about then allow clients to proceed with goal setting and putting measures in place to achieve those goals, which of course is really the key differentiator between a goal and simply a dream. This last survey was done in 2018, and prior to that in 2014. Now, I'm not sure whether it was conducted early, in other words, before 2022, which is when we would have expected it to happen. But, I can only hypothesize that the pandemic may have prompted them to do it early. But I will say that the findings that we're going to discuss today have really helped me address client concerns given the across-the-board heightened stressors people are facing today. Now, the most impactful survey question was the one I'm showing you now, which is, how would you rank the following stressors? Are you most concerned about your personal health at this time, money, relationships, or work? And the findings may surprise you. The survey results showed a number of very interesting things. So firstly, the survey identified money as the primary stress in Canadians' lives today, followed in order by health, work, and relationships. Now, with that established, the researchers then drilled further and looked at previous surveys and found a remarkably consistent trend. Financial stress has been the most significant stressor for years. Now, think about that for a minute. Even in a worldwide, life-threatening health crisis, health could not unseat financial stress as the #1 stressor that Canadians face. Just contemplate that for a minute. Or conversely, if you want to consider it a different way, this pandemic has had 15 times greater an impact on unemployment levels than the Great Recession did 13 years ago. And yet still, money, not work, is still the greatest stressor. Another curious result was the levels of financial stress were actually higher in 2018 and 2014 than they are in today's survey. Let's think back for a minute. What was happening in 2018 and 2014? To the best of my recollection, 2018 and 2014 were periods of significantly lower unemployment than we see today, and we're in the midst of the longest bull run in recorded investment history. Kind of makes you wonder whether Canadians could ever feel resilient and comfortable about their financial situations. Authors then learned that the economic fallout from this pandemic really has had a very unique fingerprint with respect to those who were most acutely affected. For starters, those under the age of 35 who are in their early careers were amongst the hardest hit. This demographic probably tends to lack seniority and could easily be a casualty of that kind of last in, first out sequencing when companies are looking to downsize. This population, there's also been more job loss and reduced hours, despite the fact that they are probably the most amenable to working from home. They're the most comfortable with the technology that would allow you to work from home. So if in compared to, let's say my generation that needed a little bit of coaxing on how to work from home, those who are the most comfortable with technology should have been the most resilient, one might think. And yet that really was not the case, and probably because those early career jobs may not be jobs that easily translate to remote work. There's also a lingering concern for this demographic because the careers of these young people could be adversely affected for a lengthy period of time because they may not, they may lack the kind of mentorship that they would have received had they been working face-to-face with their colleagues. A second finding of the survey is that there are geographic centers that have been more resilient, namely, let's say Quebec, Ontario, BC, and others that have been harder hit. The theory is that provinces with diversified economies have been able to withstand the global economic crisis better than those with economies that are concentrated in fewer industries. Albertans in particular have faced significant challenges, both from, if you recall, last winter's OPEC decision to flood markets with oil and falling world demand as a result of slowdowns in those heavier using industries, such as airlines. Lastly, the authors underscored a gender difference that was quite surprising. In contrast to previous recessions, which tended to focus on male-dominated fields like manufacturing, construction, and things like that, this pandemic has primarily had a female slant, affecting education, childcare, and the service industry. The female-dominated economic fallout, then, if you think about it, combined with a lingering wage gap, could have an irreparable effect on the wealth that women may accumulate for their retirement. Specifically, according to the authors, 13.9% of men, but 19% of women lost all or the majority of their employment hours in the initial months of this pandemic. That's a 37% difference between the genders. Similarly, 52.7% of those who received the Canada Emergency Response Benefit were mothers with minor children. This is in stark contrast to 40.2% of fathers with children the same age. Again, that's about a 30% difference. Now, let me pause here for a minute and say that I'm not a particularly political person. I tend to concern myself really just with federal budgets and other public statements in order to try to understand the direction to which the government of the day wishes to drive the economy. As a result, and in the absence, by the way, of a federal budget, may I add, I interpret the focus in the last speech from the throne that really focused on a national child care program as the government's attempt, at least, to improve future job prospects for women in the future. Whether that'll work or not, only time will tell. And so with so many recovery analogies being bandied about, you might have heard of a U-shaped recovery, a V-shaped recovery, W, all sorts of different things. One of the most startling observations has been the strong possibility of a K-shaped recovery. A K-shaped recovery can be interpreted, if you can imagine, as a significant drop, that would be that vertical line, followed by prosperity for some, that's the slanted line going up and to the right, which can be contrasted then with continued struggle for others, the slanted line going down and to the right. This analogy has been used to describe the difference between the future prospects of, let's say, the wealthy and the poor, or homeowners versus renters, or those with jobs that easily transitioned to social distancing versus those who continue to have to attend work in person. And finally, of course, perhaps between men and women. The flip side of the effects of the pandemic has also led to an important finding, namely that those who were working with a financial planner reported significantly lower rates of financial stress. Now, this may sound self-serving, but let's look at why that might be. Well, while I can't ever pretend to be able to predict what will happen or when, I do have a fair bit of confidence that something will happen at some point in your life for which you will need financial resilience. It could be an illness, an injury, a sustained period of unemployment, a divorce, or any of a number of disruptive and devastating circumstances. One of the cornerstones of financial and investment planning, and something that significantly improves resilience, is the ability to identify sources of liquidity. Now, if you know me at all, you know that I try not to use too much jargon. Liquidity is another word for the ease and tax efficiency by which you can access cash. The most important aspect to planning for liquidity is to do so before something happens that kind of shakes your world. Secondly, As a fee-for-service planner, I focus on asset allocation and strategically placing investments for tax efficiency as my way of helping you to reduce your portfolio's volatility and improve your investment returns. Now, like many of you, I rely on an investment advisor or portfolio manager to select the investments for me. I don't have a stomach for it. I have no talent in that respect. But what that does is it allows me to free up my focus on opportunities that are spelled out in the Income Tax Act. And that allows us to work on legitimately finding ways to reduce our taxes owing. Again, like many of you, I really don't have a problem paying taxes. I just don't want to pay any more than I have to. Now, I think it's fair to say that you didn't sign up for a webinar to hear what you already know, that the pandemic has been extremely stressful, it's been isolating, and no one knows when it's going to end. So let's spend some time focusing on what we can do to build resilience in the face of this uncertainty. In my opinion, financial resilience is built by understanding the resources at your disposal, understanding your ongoing obligations, adopting a kind of just-in-case mentality, and diversifying both your assets and your income streams. So let's look at each of these. Your net worth statement. As many of you who have completed a financial plan with me will know, I look at net worth statements as much more than just a list of your assets and liabilities. When we prepare a net worth statement, we're looking to identify three key components. Firstly, as I just mentioned, how much liquidity do you have? Again, that means how much cash can you access easily and tax efficiently? Secondly, is your wealth over-concentrated in your home? Now, your home can be borrowed against, but otherwise it's kind of a pain to turn into cash. There's moving expenses, there's hassles and other things. In other words, are you at risk of becoming house poor at some point in the future and being forced to sell your home to make ends meet? Lastly, are your assets situated to optimize tax efficiency? One more thing about liquidity. Now, admittedly, almost any investment can be sold in a pinch. But if we didn't learn our lesson from the market crash in the fall of 2008 or the market crash in March of 2020, please learn the lesson now. Planning for liquidity or ease of access of cash ahead of time can save you from having to sell an investment during a steep market drop. Plan your cash reserve now while markets have recovered somewhat, and it will cost you significantly less and create resilience for your household. Another lesson that is important to building resilience is understanding your cash flow. You don't want to make a budget? Fine, don't make a budget. At least have an understanding of whether your bank balance goes up, goes down, or stays the same over the course of a month or a year. This one data point allows you to make a relatively accurate assessment of how much your standard of living costs. For example, if you have a two-income household and your cash flow is balanced from month to month, you can conclude that your cost of living are roughly equal to your take-home pay for the year. However, this one detail can also help you to conclude that your household might face difficulty covering expenses if one spouse were to lose his or her job. On the other hand, with financial planning, what we can do is we can test the idea hypothetically through projections, and if we can determine that you can cover your expenses for a reasonable period of time, even let's say 3 to 6 months, in the event that one or both spouses were to lose a job, then you can conclude that your household is resilient. As I mentioned earlier, I try to interpret the government's priorities through the lens of finance. It would appear that the current government is choosing to support the economy by offering stimulus rather than encouraging people to reduce their spending, what's otherwise called austerity measures. Interestingly, if you think back even 9 months ago, this would be in stark contrast to the position of the government before the pandemic. You'll recall they were threatening higher interest rates to encourage Canadians to control their debt levels. You might remember that there was a lot of talk about stress testing mortgages to see whether people would lose their homes if interest rates spiked. Now, only history will tell us whether this current stimulus strategy, as opposed to an austerity strategy, was effective or not. So only time will tell. To that end, many luckier households have enjoyed uninterrupted income, but with little to buy. This is many considering, let's say, larger expenditures like upgrade projects or new home purchases, replacing cars, which by the way has a corollary impact, which is that buying additional cars is some people's antidote to having to use public transit because there's been a perceived higher risk of COVID infection on public transit. Or, just the age-old question of whether discretionary income would be better applied to paying down debt or investing in the future. Again, resilience comes from looking at hypothetical worst case, or as I prefer to refer to it, just in case scenarios, and determining whether these expenditures will actually impact you adversely in the long run. This can be done through projections and simulations in a safe space before any money has changed hands or before any decisions can come back to haunt you. And finally, the last item on the resilience checklist is diversification. By this, I mean diversification in many aspects of life. For example, it's incredibly common for a home to comprise the majority of your net worth, especially if you live in a large urban area where housing is so expensive. Interestingly, by the way, the hot markets seem to have shifted to suburbs and outlying areas because, again, of the perceived connection between population density and the occurrence of infection. But as I mentioned before, I like to counsel clients to build resilience by ensuring that they have a broad base of wealth beyond home equity. As you may have heard in previous seminars, I like to counsel clients to build wealth to the point where their home represents no more than 40% of their net worth, and this is usually at retirement. Early in your career, it's not uncommon for that metric to be way off, but as you pay down your home and build wealth in other areas, the goal would be to have 40% of your net worth tied to your home and no more. With reference to investment portfolios, it's very common for executives in particular, or any employee with long-standing tenure and access to payroll purchases of their company shares, to have portfolios that are grossly overconcentrated in their employer's stock. This combined with the fact that many are reticent to divest of these holdings because of something you might have heard of called familiarity bias. Now, this is the belief that you have some sort of intimate knowledge of a product or industry, and that this knowledge will allow you to make better investment outcomes. As many employees of Sears and Nortel and other large corporations who saw fortunes evaporate could attest, investment resilience comes from diversification, even when you have stockpiles of restricted share units or stock options. Resilience can come from building a portfolio around these large holdings so that your concentration in your employer's stock is somewhat controlled. In my opinion, an optimal holding would be no more than, let's say, 10 or at the very maximum, 15% of a portfolio in any one holding. Even more basic is the very real possibility that a shock to an industry could mean higher vulnerability if both spouses work in that industry. For example, the marketing and advertising field is often the first corporate budget to be cut in a market decline, and sadly, the last budget to be reestablished when markets recover. Now, resilience, in my opinion, again, can be built if both spouses are not in the same industry, or at the very least, don't work for the same employer. So when assessing a goal or reacting to life's inevitable curveballs, I take clients through a resilience checklist. In this checklist, we look at things like, as I mentioned before, the resources at your disposal, your obligations from month to month or year to year, testing some just in case scenarios, and looking for diversification. Now let's look at some examples. Rob and Rory are married. They work in the same field, and they bought their home some time ago. When they bought it, it was a bit of a stretch purchase. Now they can afford it more easily because their incomes have grown. They're thinking of upgrading their home, which is something I'm talking to a lot of clients about. Now, Rob is 54, Rory's 52. They'd like to retire, let's say, in their mid-50s. Now, Rob and Rory have a pretty good handle on their finances. Their mortgage is pretty modest, and they have accumulated some savings. They also established that they can afford their current standard of living if one of them were to lose their job. So the first two criteria are kind of satisfied. Resources, obligations, check, check. However, because they're both in the same industry, if the industry gets hit, they could both lose their jobs. So before they upgrade the home, we should probably do some projections to see if unemployment spanning, let's say, 3 to 6 months would have any sort of lingering consequence to their retirement. Similarly, although they could easily afford their current home, I'd also like to check if they've developed wealth outside of the home. Remember, building a portfolio that comprises 60% of your net worth by retirement is important unless you're intending to downsize. Again, we can perform some simulations in that safe space. They're all hypothetical, and see whether the family would be resilient in the face of a significant change to their circumstances. If we look at that ahead of time, Rob and Rory can then proceed with some confidence. On the topic of real estate, by the way, I attended a virtual conference just last week where Fidelity presented some research showing that Canadians who had formerly planned on downsizing to condos were now considering, either delaying that move or banning it altogether. Now, we can hypothesize that perhaps this change of heart, it might be due to a renewed appreciation in larger spaces because we're increasingly confined indoors. Or perhaps they're concerned about moving to a more concentrated dwelling like a condo tower, again, because of perceived concerns about concentration and infection levels. If these trends do materialize, are they likely to be long-standing? I can't pretend to know. However, this finding really does add credence to something that I often use in my projections, namely that clients who are intending to age in a home that they own should ensure that they have sufficient investment assets to carry them to age 90. Essentially, what this does is it reserves home equity for the costs of aging or for distribution through their estates. And it would appear that Fidelity's research seems to support my assumption. Let's look at another example. So after a few years of floundering, my client Marcus really did exceptionally well in investing in these last 12 years. Now, through some, whether it's good foresight or dumb luck, I'm not sure, Marcus was able to move to an all-cash position just about when the pandemic hit. And now he's incredibly nervous about moving back into the market. Now, this is a truly classic paradigm. We understand that markets certainly can't be timed, but we would kick ourselves if we bought at a high. Now, just to give you an example, my home purchase is a perfect example. My husband and I, we were loath to purchase a home in 2002 because we were certain that the market was too high. Now it's nearly 20 years later, and we still think the markets are too high, but we don't regret our decision to be in the market. So when I spoke with Marcus, I counseled him to review this resilience checklist. For Marcus, he understands very well his net worth statement, and we've already established that where his assets should be in order to make them as tax efficient as possible. So with reference to references, he gets a big check mark. Marcus also has a great grasp of his cash flow and is comfortable that he has the emergency reserve that he needs, which is about 3 months of expenses. And then he has further access to a secured line of credit if he needs anything else. So obligations, check. If anything, Marcus is stuck ruminating. In fact, he's too concerned about the just-in-case scenario. He's kicking himself for not being able to identify a good investment entry point. Sounds familiar to many. Furthermore, Marcus is not at all diversified. This is my favorite graph, perhaps of all time, and I think it's the single most important graph to understanding investment strategy. It clearly shows why market timing is impossible. Just when we feel most assured, which you can see as the data point identified as euphoria, that happy face in sort of the top right-hand part of the curve, top left-hand part of the curve, that's when we're at our highest likelihood of investment loss. Similarly, as we, let's say, ride the market tide downwards, at the point when we're the most despondent, the data point identified as depression, that's when we have the greatest opportunity for gain. Again, the point marked euphoria seems to be where Marcus moved to cash. Again, it could have been because he had some recognition that the economy was vulnerable or that he might have gotten lucky. So we might argue that he has what's referred to as a strong sell discipline. He knows when to get out of a market, but he has yet to decide upon an entry point, suggesting that he has a very poor, what's called a buy discipline. Now, I've consulted Marcus that market timing is a fool's game, and it's really only one in hindsight. So instead, I've helped him to identify his investment risk tolerance, his timeline, and then encouraged him to build a portfolio methodically and impartially. That might mean investing at certain intervals or with a target asset allocation in mind. You know, that's for Marcus and I to talk about. But what he can always do, rather than staying out of the market and kicking himself for not getting in, he can always just rebalance if the markets show tremendous strength or weakness, rebalancing back to his target allocation. Research has shown that if his timeline is long enough, it really won't matter if he gets in at the perfect high or the perfect low. Just being in the market is important. The last scenario I'm going to show you is kind of a sadder one, where Sharon I'm working with is in her mid-50s and recently lost her job. Now, you may be acquainted with this term where her employer wants her off the books. And that means that they want to pay her severance, as quickly as possible so that they can show shareholders a reduction in expenses, starting, whether it's the next calendar year or the next fiscal year. So they're pressuring her to make some decisions about the severance offer. Now, Sharon has engaged a lawyer, so they're working on the deal, but they also need to put the deal into context. So Sharon and I used the resilience checklist to interpret the offer. Starting with her net worth statement, we identified that she has some sources of cash, which allow her to be patient through the negotiation process. This is really important for her lawyer because this means that her lawyer doesn't ever have to position Sharon as desperate. He can wait to see what her employer will offer. We also projected that she was well on her way to accumulating a portfolio for retirement that could keep her home from being overly concentrated. So resources, check. Next, we prepared a cash flow statement so that Sharon would know what her monthly expenses were. Now, that didn't seem to be as much of an issue as the tax consequences of the severance. You see, in severance negotiations, timing is everything. Since we're very far into the calendar year now, if Sharon receives a large lump sum paid in November, for example, that amount would be paid on top of 11 months of regular salary, and she'll lose a ton of it to taxation. This fact might help Sharon's employment lawyer negotiate a salary continuance rather than a lump sum that would be paid on top of 11 months of regular salary. We then looked at what might happen if Sharon's unemployment is prolonged. And we were able to determine that Sharon has enough, let's say, readily available cash to sustain her until January 1st. What this means is that we have a very important tax controlling measure that we can use. despite the fact that Sharon might need some of that money, within a few months, she can throw as much as she's allowed to into her RSP because she has RSP carry forward contribution room. And that is going to help her control her taxes for 2020. Then, if she's right, or the worst case, or as I like to refer to it, just in case scenario materializes, that it takes her a while to find a job in 2021, she can withdraw those same funds from the RSP at what we conceivably could, assume would be a lower marginal tax rate in 2021. And that certainly will help her save tax. As for diversification, Sharon's well on her way to repaying her mortgage before retirement and building wealth to be able to support her retirement income. So she gets a big check mark there. So in summary, the one thing I want you to know is, and I don't want this to sound self-serving, but you really do not need to go it alone. The financial service industry acknowledges that certified financial planning professionals like myself, we do a deeper dive and spend more time with clients than any other advisor. Investment advisors and ETF capital management in particular tend to appreciate the thoroughness of the understanding that we build together because it enables us to make better investment decisions and investment decisions all around. Similarly, accountants love the deep dive that we do because so much pressure is put upon them to report what's happened already that they can't always spend the time they need projecting into the future. So it's the insight into the work that we do together that brings invaluable information to our allied professionals. And of course, clients appreciate having an unbiased person that can help them prioritize between, let's say, competing objectives. We're here for you through thick and through thin. The plan itself, you should know, is front-loaded in effort and cost for that matter. But what we achieve is that depth of understanding. And I promise I will make every effort to make the process as easy on you as possible. Let me do the heavy lifting. What I can also say is, anecdotally, most clients save many, many multiples of the fee that we charge in taxes alone. But even when the plan is complete, life doesn't stop. Your circumstances evolve. Some changes will result from personal predicaments like a windfall, a child, a grandchild, or other kind of happy fortuitous occasion. Others might be more systemic, such as a health or financial crisis that we're all facing today. Other challenges will simply happen due to influences beyond our control, like the markets or government announcements. The annual review that we do ensures that the strategies that you're implementing continue to be worthwhile and can both anticipate and respond to life's challenges. Now, next month, I'll be sharing some insight into a very disheartening trend. Divorce rates are going up, and this is an unexpected byproduct of the pandemic. Now, I have particular training in this area and sadly a wealth of experience as well in terms of working with clients who are undergoing these types of transitions. So please, in the email that will accompany an announcement about the next seminar, you'll get an invitation to November 24th seminar. It'll be at 10 a.m. Eastern, just like this one was, and you'll know exactly how to register for it. And again, please share it if you'd like. The goal of that seminar, very much like the one that we did today, will be on trying to set yourself up for the realities of the divorce process, some reassurance, and how to build your financial life 2.0. As I mentioned at the beginning, I wish I could take questions, but I can't today. But a recorded version of the seminar will be made available to you soon. And again, please share it with others. And here are some various ways that you can reach me if you have specific questions on the content that I talked about today, or you have questions about financial life strategies in general. Again, I'm the head of financial life strategies, both for UPotential and ETF capital management. And as always, it would be my pleasure to help in any way that I can. Thank you so much for your time and attention today.